I never imagined that my quiet little cul-de-sac would turn into the setting for the kind of neighborhood drama people binge-watch online, shaking their heads and muttering about entitlement and power trips. But looking back, the warning signs were always there, simmering beneath the surface like a slow-burning fuse. The Homeowners Association had been around long before I bought the house, and everyone knew who really ran it. It wasn't the board as a whole, or the bylaws printed neatly in a binder nobody ever read. It was her. She had lived on the street for over a decade, long enough to believe that time itself had granted her authority. She walked the neighborhood every morning with a clipboard, inspecting lawns, fences, trash cans, and cars, as if she were the final arbiter of order. People called her the HOA president, though her actual title changed depending on the year. What never changed was her certainty that the neighborhood belonged to her in spirit, if not on paper. I had moved in less than a year earlier. The house came with a two-car garage, which was one of the main reasons I bought it. I worked with equipment and tools that needed to be secured, and the garage wasn't a luxury, it was essential. I kept it clean, organized, and used exactly as the rules allowed. No broken-down cars, no hoarding, no violations. I followed the rules carefully, not because I respected the HOA's authority, but because I didn't want trouble. Trouble, unfortunately, didn't need an invitation. It started, innocently enough, with a notice taped to my door one afternoon while I was at work. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze, a bright orange warning that screamed for attention. It claimed I was underutilizing my garage space and that the HOA would be conducting a temporary reassignment of parking resources due to upcoming maintenance work elsewhere in the neighborhood. It was written in vague, overly confident language, as if the authority behind it was unquestionable. I reread the notice several times, convinced I had misunderstood. There was no clause in the bylaws that allowed the HOA to use a homeowner's private garage for anything, let alone for parking other residents' vehicles. The garage was deeded property. It was mine. I sent an email that night, calm and direct, asking for clarification and citing the section of the bylaws that explicitly stated garages were private property. I didn't get a response. Not that night, not the next morning, not the day after that. 3 days later, I came home from work and felt my stomach drop before I even pulled into the driveway. The garage door was open. At first, I thought I had made a mistake that morning, rushing out and forgetting to close it. That brief moment of self-doubt vanished as soon as I stepped out of my truck. Inside my garage, parked neatly side by side and blocking access to nearly everything I owned, were 3 trucks, large commercial-style trucks, each one clearly marked with the logo of a local landscaping company. My tools were pushed against the wall, my shelves had been shifted, boxes I had carefully stacked were now crammed wherever there had been room. The space that had been mine was suddenly unrecognizable, transformed into a makeshift depot without my permission. For a moment, I just stood there, keys still in my hand, trying to process what I was seeing. Then the anger hit, sharp and immediate, cutting through the shock. Someone had entered my property. Someone had moved my things. Someone had decided that my garage was no longer mine. It didn't take long to figure out who that someone was. A quick walk down the street confirmed it. The landscaping company had been contracted by the HOA for a beautification project, one that apparently required staging their vehicles somewhere overnight. The street parking was too cluttered, and the HOA president had decided that my garage was the perfect solution. According to her logic, I wasn't using it properly anyway. I knocked on her door, already knowing how it would go. When she opened it, her expression was a mix of smug satisfaction and performative confusion, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. She gestured vaguely toward my house and launched into a long explanation about community needs, temporary inconvenience, and how I should be grateful for the improvements being made to the neighborhood. She spoke as though my garage was a shared amenity, like the pool or the clubhouse, and my objections were petty and selfish. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't argue in circles, I simply stated again that my garage was private property and that I wanted the trucks removed immediately.
She dismissed the request with a smile that never reached her eyes. According to her, the decision had already been made. The trucks would be there for the duration of the project, and if I had a problem with it, I could take it up with the board. That was when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a power move. I went back to my house, heart pounding, and closed the garage door. Then I locked it. The trucks were inside, the garage was secured, and for the first time since I had moved in, the balance of control shifted, if only slightly. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my phone, weighing my options. I could send another email, I could call a lawyer, I could wait and see if the HOA would back down, but the image of my belongings shoved aside, my space invaded, kept replaying in my mind. Instead, I did something I never thought I'd need to do in a suburban neighborhood governed by an HOA. I called the sheriff's office. As I explained the situation, calmly and factually, I felt a strange mix of nerves and resolve. This was no longer about parking or landscaping. It was about property rights, trespassing, and a woman who believed the rules only applied to everyone else. Outside, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cul-de-sac. Somewhere down the street, the HOA president was likely congratulating herself on another successful exercise of authority. She had no idea what was coming next. And as the distant sound of sirens grew closer, the stage was set for a confrontation that would ripple through the neighborhood for months to come, changing everything I thought I knew about living under an HOA.
The air in the cul-de-sac felt heavier than usual that evening, almost charged with anticipation. It was as if the neighborhood itself sensed that a line had been crossed. Inside my house, I paced back and forth, glancing at the locked garage door every few minutes, wondering how the HOA president would react when she realized her carefully orchestrated plan had hit an immovable obstacle. The trucks were still there, parked like statues, and each passing minute made my resolve stronger. When the sheriff's car finally rolled into the driveway, the quiet hum of the engine sounded like a drumbeat announcing the beginning of a showdown. Two deputies stepped out, uniformed and professional, exuding a calm authority that contrasted sharply with the simmering chaos of the street. I met them at the curb, phone still clutched in my hand, and went over the situation as clearly and concisely as I could. I explained that 3 large trucks had been placed in my garage without my permission, that my property had been accessed without consent, and that the situation was ongoing when I locked the door. The deputies listened carefully, taking notes, asking a few pointed questions about ownership, property lines, and the nature of the HOA's involvement. Their presence alone seemed to shift the neighborhood dynamic. I could see heads popping out of windows and cars slowing down as neighbors tried to catch a glimpse of the unfolding drama. Word spreads fast on streets like mine, especially when it involves someone as notorious as the HOA president. They asked me to unlock the garage so they could inspect the vehicles. I hesitated for just a moment, then explained that I wasn't comfortable opening it until they gave me clear instructions, fearing that doing so might complicate things legally. They nodded, professional and patient, and assured me that they understood the delicate balance between enforcing the law and respecting private property. By the time we had arranged for the deputies to inspect the garage, the HOA president had noticed the commotion. She appeared at the end of her driveway, arms crossed, projecting her usual aura of unshakable confidence. But there was a flicker of unease in her eyes, subtle but unmistakable. She hadn't expected law enforcement to become involved, and now her carefully constructed authority was being challenged in real time. I watched as she approached, clipboard in hand, attempting to interject before the deputies even made a move. She tried to explain the necessity of the trucks being there, citing the HOA's project, community improvements, and the supposed benefits to the neighborhood. Her voice was measured, her gestures precise, every bit the theater of entitlement she had perfected over the years. The deputies, however, were unfazed. They asked her if she had explicit permission from the homeowner to place the vehicles inside the garage. She hesitated, a brief crack in her otherwise polished demeanor. Then she stammered something about the board's decision and neighborhood rules, but it became clear that she didn't have any written authorization.
Not a single document, not a single signed note from me or anyone with legal authority over my property. One of the deputies glanced at me and asked if I had seen any communication granting her permission. I shook my head. Everything was verbal at most, and that didn't hold any legal weight. The deputy made a note of it, documenting that this was indeed a case of unauthorized use of private property. The HOA president's face hardened. I could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the moment when someone who has always wielded authority suddenly realizes that the rules she relies on for control may not protect her. She tried to argue again, emphasizing the greater good, the community benefit, and the temporary nature of the trucks, but the deputies maintained their focus on the legal facts. It was almost surreal to watch. For years, she had operated with near absolute power in our little corner of the world. Residents feared her inspections, tolerated her fines, and complied with her demands. But now, under the scrutiny of law enforcement, her power felt fragile. I could see her scanning the street, perhaps looking for allies, but the neighborhood seemed quieter than usual. People were watching, yes, but nobody was stepping in to defend her. After what felt like an eternity of explanations and note-taking, the deputies turned to me. They explained my rights in clear, no-nonsense terms. Trespassing, unauthorized use of property, potential liability for damage to my vehicles or belongings, all of it was on the HOA president and her contractors, not me. They advised that the safest course of action was to keep the garage locked until the situation could be formally resolved and documented, which I had already done. Before leaving, they made it very clear that if anyone attempted to remove the locks, access my garage, or interfere with my property again without my consent, it would be treated as a criminal matter. They also gave me a case number and told me to document everything, including any further communications from the HOA. It was validation of what I already knew. This was trespassing, plain and simple. Once the sheriff's car disappeared around the corner, the quiet returned, but it felt different. The street no longer had its usual subdued calm. It was tense, expectant. I could almost hear the wheels turning in the HOA president's mind. She had underestimated me. She had underestimated the law, and now the consequences of her actions were becoming painfully clear. Later that evening, I began cataloging everything: photos of the trucks, the interior of the garage, timestamps on emails, and screenshots of the HOA's notices. Every shred of evidence mattered. I realized that this was no longer just a confrontation over a few vehicles. This was a defining moment about property rights, boundaries, and accountability. The HOA president, predictably, didn't respond to my documentation. Instead, I could feel her moving through the neighborhood, perhaps plotting her next move, perhaps warning others of her version of the story. But by then, the narrative had already shifted. The law was on my side, and I had solid proof that she had crossed a line. By the time night settled over the cul-de-sac, I sat by the window, watching the shadows stretch across my driveway. The garage remained locked, the trucks were still inside, and for the first time I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, knowing that a line had been drawn. The HOA president had made her move, but she had overreached. And overreach, as anyone who has watched viral HOA drama knows, often comes with consequences that extend far beyond the initial act. I didn't know exactly what those consequences would be, but I was ready to find out. The next day promised escalation, confrontation, and perhaps the kind of drama that only seems to exist in suburban YouTube stories. And I knew deep down that this was just the beginning. The night settled, quiet but tense, and the garage, locked and unyielding, became a silent fortress, a monument to the fact that some lines, once crossed, cannot be ignored. The next morning, the neighborhood would awaken to a storm.
Morning came slowly, like it was hesitant to enter a neighborhood already bracing for confrontation. The sunlight slanted across my driveway, glinting off the locked garage door and the 3 trucks still trapped inside. Overnight, the cul-de-sac had gone from ordinary suburban calm to a stage set for a neighborhood drama worthy of a viral YouTube thumbnail. Cars crept down the street slowly as neighbors peeked out of curtains and across fences, curiosity competing with caution. Some waved nervously. Others whispered to each other about the chaos that had unfolded right under their perfectly manicured lawns. It wasn't long before the HOA president made her first move of the day. She appeared in her signature style, perfectly pressed blouse, clipboard in hand, and an expression that could have been carved from marble. She walked deliberately toward my house, her gait projecting authority and irritation in equal measure. From the moment she stepped onto my property line, though she didn't cross it, her presence felt like an assertion of dominance, a silent declaration that she had a plan to reclaim control. Her first tactic was documentation, a method she seemed to favor. She circled the driveway, scribbling in her clipboard, taking notes on the locked garage and the trucks within. I watched from behind the curtains, capturing every detail with my phone. There was an almost performative quality to her movements, as if the act of writing and observing itself would somehow validate her claim over my property. But the law, as the deputies had reminded me the day before, didn't care about performative authority. Next came the letters. By mid-morning, I had a stack of notices shoved under my door, each more insistent than the last. The wording was aggressive yet passive-aggressive, a cocktail that read like a blend of legalese and personal vendetta. One letter threatened fines, claiming that continued obstruction of the HOA's approved project could result in penalties. Another suggested that I was disturbing the peace and harmony of the community by refusing access to my own garage. Each note ended with a polite but firm reminder, "We hope you will reconsider your position." I read them carefully, documenting each one. It was clear that she was escalating her tactics, moving from subtle manipulation to overt intimidation. This wasn't just about trucks anymore. It was about sending a message. Compliance wasn't optional in her neighborhood, and resistance would be met with increasingly elaborate pressure. By midday, word had traveled further down the street. Neighbors began appearing at the edges of their driveways, smartphones raised discreetly, capturing footage for their own records, or perhaps just for gossip. I could feel the weight of eyes on me, some judging my stance, others watching in fascination, waiting for a spectacle. There were nods of solidarity from a few residents who had clashed with her before, their faces betraying private stories of fines, warnings, and inspections. Others whispered behind closed doors, wary of attracting her attention. The HOA president thrived on fear and social pressure, and her tactics had left many residents complicit, silent, and cautious. I decided to remain strategic. Every move mattered. I sent an email to the HOA board, CCing the same deputies who had come the day before. I outlined the timeline, the initial notice, the placement of the trucks, my response, the call to law enforcement, and the continued presence of her letters. I requested formal acknowledgement of my property rights and insisted that no further unauthorized use of my garage would be tolerated. It was both a defensive move and a public record, a way to protect myself in case she decided to escalate further. Her response came faster than I expected. Within hours, I noticed 2 of the landscaping trucks leave the garage, but only partially. They were repositioned in the driveway, still blocking access, still effectively controlling my property. The third truck remained inside, a stubborn testament to her unwillingness to yield. It was a tactical retreat, a calculated compromise, but it didn't change the fact that she was asserting control. What followed was a subtle psychological campaign. Flyers appeared on my lawn overnight, each praising cooperation with community projects and emphasizing responsibility to neighbors. The wording was carefully chosen, meant to shame without directly accusing, and each included a logo from the HOA letterhead. I found myself reading them multiple times, analyzing the phrasing, the timing, and the placement.
This wasn't casual vandalism or innocent neighborly commentary. It was a methodical attempt to sway perception, to make resistance seem unreasonable. As the day progressed, I noticed more neighbors taking sides, either explicitly or quietly. Some sympathized, leaving small gestures of support, smiles, nods, a quick thumbs up from across the street. Others seemed aligned with the HOA president, offering thinly veiled criticism or casual remarks about following the rules. I realized that the situation had transformed my private property dispute into a community spectacle. My garage was now a symbol, my resistance a story in motion, and every neighbor an audience member. By late afternoon, the pressure began to intensify. A formal letter arrived, this time threatening legal action unless I immediately remove all obstructions and grant access to HOA contracted vehicles. The language was carefully legalistic, citing clauses that didn't actually apply to private property but were designed to intimidate. The tone made it clear that she was preparing for a more serious escalation, perhaps involving lawyers or more formal complaints. I sat at my desk reviewing all of the documentation, the emails, the letters, the photographs, the recordings of her on my property, and the deputy's notes from the previous day. The evidence was mounting, and I realized that this was no longer just a battle over trucks. It had become a test of authority, law, and neighborhood power dynamics. By evening, the neighborhood had gone quiet again, but the tension was palpable. The locked garage, now partially empty but still defiant, had become a symbol of resistance. The HOA president was still active, still planning, still maneuvering, but I felt an unexpected sense of empowerment. The law was on my side, the evidence was in my hands, and the narrative was shifting from her control to my defense. And yet, I knew this was far from over. The HOA president had never been known to back down, and in my experience, persistence was her greatest weapon. The coming days promised more escalation, legal threats, public displays, and perhaps attempts to turn neighbors against me. As night fell, I realized that I had entered a new phase of the conflict. The calm, quiet cul-de-sac of my imagination no longer existed. In its place was a stage, set for confrontation, strategy, and the slow-burning drama that only HOA politics could produce. And in the center of it all, my locked garage remained, a fortress, a statement, and a challenge. Tomorrow, the war would continue, and it would be louder.
The morning air in the cul-de-sac felt thick, almost electric, carrying the faint tension of a neighborhood on edge. Word had spread fast, faster than I had anticipated. By sunrise, I noticed more cars parked strategically to observe my driveway, and more neighbors peeking from windows and fences. It was as if the simple act of locking my garage had become a public spectacle, a slow-motion drama that everyone wanted a front-row seat to. The HOA president wasted no time escalating. Overnight, a formal letter had arrived in my mailbox, this one more carefully drafted than anything before. It was typed on official letterhead with bolded clauses and legal citations designed to intimidate. The tone was simultaneously polite and threatening, implying serious consequences if I continued to deny access to the trucks. Phrases like breach of community compliance and immediate legal remedies were sprinkled throughout, carefully chosen to sound menacing without actually stating a law had been broken. I read the letter multiple times, taking detailed notes and photographing each page. Despite the grandiose language, I recognized the pattern. It was a classic HOA tactic: overwhelm the homeowner with official-looking threats in order to coerce compliance. I could almost hear the click of her heels and the satisfied mutter of "that'll teach them" as she imagined me trembling at the sight of the letter. But I didn't tremble. I had already documented everything: the deputy's visit, the photographs of the trucks, timestamps, and emails. Her letters were nothing more than an attempt to rewrite reality. By mid-morning, I began noticing subtle changes in the neighborhood dynamic. Some neighbors now acted as unofficial messengers or reporters, quietly relaying updates between houses. A few concerned residents approached me casually, mentioning that they'd heard about the situation and implying that my actions might bring trouble to the street. Their words were carefully measured, the tone polite but judgmental, meant to instill doubt without stating outright opposition. I realized that the HOA president had activated a psychological operation, using gossip and social pressure as weapons. I stayed inside, calmly documenting each interaction. Every whispered comment, every raised eyebrow, every sly glance was cataloged alongside photos and emails. In the world of HOA drama, perception often carried as much weight as legality. My response was simple: remain calm, stay organized, and keep the garage locked. The trucks were still inside, partially moved to the driveway, but still inaccessible without my consent, a constant reminder that authority wasn't absolute when backed by the law. By afternoon, the president took another step. She appeared at the end of her driveway, holding a camera, documenting my property, my garage, and even the positioning of my own vehicles. From a distance, she gestured toward the locked garage as if recording proof of my obstruction. Her movements were precise, performative, and undoubtedly intended for future use, possibly as evidence in a complaint, possibly for social leverage within the HOA. I watched, phone in hand, capturing her every motion for my own records. The gossip network was in full swing. Across the street, neighbors whispered as they walked dogs or retrieved mail. By now, even people who had previously been neutral were speculating on my actions, some framing me as stubborn, others as brave. Flyers began appearing on some lawns, unsigned but clearly meant to influence public perception. Phrases like "cooperation builds community" or "help your neighbors, support HOA projects" were printed in bold, perfectly legible text. The tone was innocuous to the untrained eye, but I recognized the intent: manipulate opinion to create pressure. It became apparent that the HOA president was preparing to escalate beyond letters and social maneuvering. There was a quiet intensity to her movements, a preparation for a formal complaint. Likely she was seeking legal counsel or planning to leverage board meetings to enforce her version of control. Her usual confidence was intact, but I could sense the calculation behind it, the precision of someone who had never lost, plotting to turn the rules to her favor. Late that afternoon, I received a call from the local sheriff's office. The deputies who had visited the day before checked in to ensure the situation hadn't escalated further, and reminded me to maintain all documentation. They emphasized that continued unauthorized access or any attempt to remove the locks by the HOA or its contractors would constitute trespassing. Their reassurance was grounding. It reminded me that while neighborhood politics could feel overwhelming, law enforcement prioritized facts and evidence over perception or entitlement. By evening, the cul-de-sac had become a stage. I could see silhouettes moving behind blinds, neighbors whispering as they glanced toward my driveway. The trucks remained, and with each passing hour, the locked garage became a monument, a symbol of resistance against arbitrary authority. The HOA president had successfully turned this into a community spectacle, but the law, documentation, and my measured response kept the upper hand. As night fell, I reflected on the day. The HOA president had escalated tactically: formal, legal-looking threats, social pressure through gossip and flyers, public documentation of my property, and subtle psychological warfare. Each move was designed to intimidate and isolate, yet I remained steadfast, knowing that my evidence, the deputy's prior visit, and the clearly unauthorized placement of the trucks were my strongest defense. The stage was set for the next act. The neighborhood drama wasn't over, it was only intensifying. By keeping my garage locked and documenting every move, I had turned a private property dispute into a strategic standoff, and the HOA president was clearly gearing up for a legal confrontation that would test not just the bylaws, but the social hierarchy she had long controlled. As the street went dark and quiet, I realized that this wasn't just about trucks, garages, or even letters anymore. It was about power, perception, and the lengths some people would go to assert authority. The next day likely would bring attorneys, more letters, and perhaps attempts to sway neighbors further. And in that calm darkness, I felt a strange sense of anticipation. I had chosen my side, and the HOA president had chosen hers. Tomorrow, the suburban battlefield would expand. The morning arrived with a strange, uneasy quiet. The cul-de-sac felt different now, tense, like the calm before a storm. Overnight, it seemed every neighbor had taken a side, whether openly or silently. Some nodded supportively as they passed my driveway, others whispered in clusters, sharing speculation and theories. Even the usual sounds of suburban life, mail trucks, distant lawnmowers, children riding bikes, seemed muted, as if the street itself was holding its breath. The first sign that the HOA president was escalating came in the form of a large, professionally printed envelope slipped under my door. It contained a formal notice of potential legal action, referencing clauses of the HOA bylaws, citations to state statutes that were vaguely relevant, and threats of fines, liens, and even legal fees. The language was precise, intimidating, and designed to make any homeowner feel vulnerable. It was a document meant to impress, confuse, and intimidate. Classic HOA maneuvering, with the added theatrics of legal formatting and official stamps. I sat at my desk, going line by line, comparing each claim to the actual bylaws and state law. None of the citations applied to my situation. Every threat was conditional, speculative, and lacking real enforcement power. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that it was carefully designed to create fear, uncertainty, and social pressure. I documented the entire letter, photographing it, scanning it, and saving timestamps for my records. Evidence was everything. By mid-morning, the neighborhood's attention had reached a fever pitch. Word spread quickly that the HOA president had filed paperwork regarding the garage dispute, and neighbors began speculating wildly. Some sympathized with me openly, nodding as they walked by or giving quiet thumbs-ups. Others seemed impressed by her assertiveness, whispering about authority and keeping the neighborhood in order. I realized that my private property disputes had transformed into a public performance. Every glance, every comment, every movement was being scrutinized, analyzed, and judged. The trucks remained, partially in the driveway and partially in the garage, immovable without my consent. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and tension as I looked at them. They were no longer simply vehicles, they were symbols, trophies of an escalating conflict, and barriers that both literally and figuratively represented the power struggle between me and the HOA president. By early afternoon, the president had taken a more direct approach. She appeared at the end of her driveway, dressed impeccably as always, clipboard in hand, now accompanied by a local attorney she had apparently retained. They walked deliberately toward my property line, speaking in hushed tones that I could only partly overhear. It was clear that legal action was imminent and that she had prepared herself with counsel ready to intimidate or negotiate. I remained inside, documenting everything. I knew better than to engage directly without a strategic plan. As they spoke quietly, I could see her gesturing toward my locked garage, clearly explaining her version of events. The attorney nodded, occasionally making notes, reinforcing the impression that my resistance would soon face a formal challenge. It was classic HOA escalation. First letters, then social pressure, now legal posturing. Throughout the day, neighbors continued to act as an unofficial audience. Cars slowed down, children paused in the street, and pedestrians lingered longer than necessary, as if anticipating the next move. Rumors circulated, some accurate, some wildly exaggerated. By the evening, I realized the conflict had taken on a life of its own. The locked garage became a symbol of resistance, and I, the reluctant protagonist in a drama that now seemed larger than any individual dispute. That evening, I prepared for the next phase. I gathered all documentation, photographs of the trucks, timestamps of the letters and emails, recordings of neighbors' interactions, notes from the sheriff's deputies, and my own observations of the president's movements. I organized everything carefully, creating a timeline that showed a clear pattern of unauthorized entry, intimidation, and social manipulation.
This would be essential if the legal challenge escalated. The final act of the day came in the form of another letter from the HOA board, this one surprisingly conciliatory in tone, likely influenced by the visibility of my evidence and the attention the conflict was drawing. They suggested mediation, requesting a meeting to resolve matters amicably, while still subtly supporting the president's claims. It was a calculated move, a way to appear reasonable while signaling that the pressure and potential legal threat would continue if I didn't comply. As night fell, I looked out over the cul-de-sac, quiet now under the soft glow of streetlights. The trucks remained, the garage remained locked, and the neighborhood remained divided. The HOA president had clearly escalated her tactics, moving from informal authority to formal legal threats, from neighborhood whispers to the involvement of an attorney, and from letters to the possibility of mediation or court action. And yet, I felt strangely empowered. My preparation, documentation, and knowledge of my rights gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt before. The HOA president had underestimated the consequences of her actions, and while she had escalated dramatically, I had already anticipated much of her strategy. Tomorrow promised confrontation. Mediation or formal legal discussions would bring both sides into sharper conflict, and the neighborhood's unofficial spectators would be watching, whispering, and perhaps choosing sides. The garage, locked and defiant, remained the centerpiece of the battle. A silent statement that authority could be challenged and that property, when defended properly, was not just a possession but a boundary that demanded respect. The showdown, I realized, was just beginning.
The sun rose over the cul-de-sac with a calm that felt almost deceptive. After days of escalating tension, legal threats, gossip, and truck invasions, the stage was finally set for the resolution. By morning, neighbors had already begun their silent surveillance, curious, anxious, and ready for the latest installment of the unfolding suburban drama. The locked garage stood at the center of it all, a fortress of defiance and evidence of my refusal to bow to arbitrary authority. The HOA president arrived early, flanked by her attorney and carrying a binder stuffed with letters, citations, and printouts. She radiated confidence, moving with precision, clipboard in hand, fully prepared for what she likely imagined would be the climax of her campaign. She positioned herself at the end of her driveway, strategically out of my property line, but within view of every neighbor, as though the drama needed an audience to validate its significance. I had spent the previous evening organizing my own arsenal of evidence. Photographs of the trucks in the garage, timestamps of the HOA notices, records of emails, notes from sheriff deputies, and even documentation of the neighborhood gossip and flyers. Every detail mattered. I knew this confrontation would not just be about the trucks, it would be about property rights, authority, and public perception. The HOA mediator, along with the second attorney, arrived shortly after. It was clear that the HOA had realized this was no longer a simple dispute. They had underestimated my preparedness and the documentation I had gathered. The mediator suggested sitting down to discuss a resolution before any legal action was taken. I agreed, knowing that any meeting could be leveraged as evidence if needed, and that appearing cooperative while standing firm would strengthen my position. The meeting began in the driveway, with the locked garage looming in the background as an unspoken but undeniable statement. The HOA president immediately launched into a rehearsed explanation of the trucks, the community project, and the supposed need for temporary access to my garage. Her attorney echoed her points, referencing bylaws and the neighborhood's collective responsibility. The tone was formal, precise, but lacking substance. Her entire argument rested on assumption and her personal interpretation of authority. I calmly presented my evidence, one item at a time. Photographs showed the trucks parked without consent, emails and letters demonstrated the lack of written authorization, notes from the sheriff confirmed that my property had been trespassed upon. I explained without emotion that the garage was private property, that the trucks had been placed inside without permission, and that any continued obstruction or trespass could be legally actionable. Every point was documented, verifiable, and unassailable. As I went through the evidence, I noticed subtle shifts in the HOA president's demeanor. Her confidence wavered, just slightly, each time I referenced law enforcement or official records. She tried to interject, citing community benefits and goodwill, but her points lacked the foundation of authority, and her attorney seemed increasingly uncomfortable, flipping through the binder for anything that could support her claims. There was a visible tension in the air, an acknowledgement, however silent, that the battle might not go as planned. Neighbors gathered subtly, drawn by the unfolding confrontation. Some leaned over fences, others peered from windows. It was clear that everyone was watching, not just for drama, but for justice. The narrative had shifted. What had begun as the HOA president asserting control was now seen as overreach, and my resistance had become a lesson in standing up for property rights. By mid-afternoon, the mediator interjected, emphasizing compromise and resolution. It became apparent that the HOA president's legal threats lacked enforceability. After careful negotiation, it was agreed that the trucks would be permanently removed from my garage. A formal statement was drafted and signed by the HOA board, acknowledging my ownership rights and clarifying that no future project could involve my property without explicit written consent. The victory was not just legal, but symbolic. The locked garage had endured. The trucks were removed later that evening, backed out carefully by the landscaping company under my supervision. My belongings were restored to their original positions, untouched and unscathed. The act of reclaiming my garage felt monumental, not just as a defense of property, but as a declaration against arbitrary authority. The HOA president, now visibly deflated, attempted to salvage face, offering vague statements about community spirit and moving forward together. But the audience, the neighbors, had already witnessed the reality. Her authority had limits, and my persistence, backed by documentation and law, had prevailed. In the following days, the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Some residents approached me, congratulating my steadfastness or expressing relief that the situation was resolved. Others, who had previously whispered in support of the HOA president, kept their distance, having witnessed firsthand the consequences of overreach. The gossip gradually died down, replaced by an unspoken understanding. Boundaries were now clearly defined, and respect for private property had been reinforced. The garage itself became a quiet monument, a reminder that rules, laws, and personal boundaries mattered more than entitlement or intimidation. The trucks were gone, the letters ceased, and the flyers stopped appearing. Life resumed its rhythm. Children rode bikes, mail was delivered, and neighbors mowed lawns, but the memory of the standoff lingered, whispered in casual conversation, and reflected in wary glances from anyone tempted to test the limits of authority. For me, the lesson was profound. Standing firm, documenting every detail, and knowing your rights could turn the tide against even the most assertive adversary. What had begun as a simple dispute over trucks in my garage had evolved into a story of empowerment, strategy, and neighborhood justice. And though the HOA president remained on the street, still walking her morning rounds with clipboard in hand, there was a subtle difference now. The power dynamics had shifted. The legend of the locked garage and the homeowner who refused to yield would not be forgotten. The neighborhood had witnessed a small victory for personal rights, and in the quiet aftermath, I finally allowed myself a deep exhale. My garage was mine, my property was respected, and in the world of HOA drama, that was nothing short of a triumph. The cul-de-sac returned to its quiet rhythm, but the story of the trucks, the locked garage, and the relentless HOA president would echo in whispered tales and YouTube recountings for years to come.